This instructional video is only to be used as a training aid. It is not intended as a replacement for the operating instructions or repair manuals. Fire hydrant repairs should be performed only by properly trained maintenance personnel. And remember, always use the appropriate safety equipment, such as eye protection and gloves. And always use genuine Jones parts. This training video will illustrate the recommended operation and maintenance procedures for the Jones J4060 and J4060M ductile iron wet barrel fire hydrant with a Storz pumper nozzle. Let's begin with how to remove and replace the Storz nozzle. First, isolate the hydrant by closing the isolation valve. To remove the Storz cap, press on the red lock while rotating the cap 1/4 turn counterclockwise. The red lock should pivot freely around the screw. If you have any problem removing the Storz cap, do not attempt to force it. Instead, remove the highest hose nozzle cap. And open the highest hose nozzle valve, turning it 3 turns counterclockwise. Make sure the hydrant has stopped draining water to confirm it has been properly isolated. Now open the Storz outlet valve with 3 turns counterclockwise to relieve pressure on the back side of the Storz cap. Again, wait for the hydrant to stop draining. Then the cap should come off easily. To remove the Storz nozzle, check first to see if there is an Allen screw positioned inside the Storz nozzle. Loosen it with a 5/32" Allen wrench. Then use the socket wrench, Jones part number 370050, to remove the Storz nozzle. Turning the wrench counterclockwise. Once the nozzle is removed, inspect the inlet threads and the inside of the hydrant to make sure they are free of loose debris and foreign objects. Replace the Storz nozzle O-ring, making sure it is seated against the nozzle shoulder. With your fingers, lightly lubricate the O-ring with a non-toxic anti-seize lubricant before installation. Using the socket wrench 370050, thread the nozzle into the hydrant head, tightening it to 300 foot-pounds, 405 Newton-meters. Then tighten the Allen screw on the inside of the nozzle with a 5/32" Allen wrench. Now close the pumper nozzle valve. If you have not already done so, remove the uppermost hose nozzle cap. Then open its valve 3 counterclockwise turns. Open the isolation valve slightly and allow the air to evacuate the hydrant. When water begins to flow from the top hose nozzle and all air is evacuated, slowly close its valve completely with no more than 30 foot-pounds, 40 Newton-meters of torque. Check the seals at the replaced nozzle as well as the other nozzles. If debris has lodged in any valve, open it completely to flush out the debris. Then close it. Once all the valves are sealed, fully open up the isolation valve and replace all caps just tightly enough so they cannot be removed by hand. Caution: Do not open any of the hydrant valves without removing the appropriate cap first. If the cap is not removed first, before a valve is opened and closed, pressurized water can become trapped between the valve and the cap. This will make a cap without a vent hole difficult to remove. This segment will demonstrate how to remove a hard-to-remove cap which has no vent hole or a clogged vent hole and has been locked by trapped water pressure behind it. If there is debris lodged in the valve, or if the valve was accidentally opened before the cap is removed, then the cap will be under pressure and it will be difficult to remove. In that case, first, isolate the hydrant by closing the isolation valve. Next, remove the uppermost cap other than the one that is hard to remove. Then open its valve 3 turns to relieve the pressurized water from the hydrant and to make sure the hydrant is isolated. Once the pressure is relieved, open the valve with the cap that's difficult to remove. Opening this valve will relieve pressurized water between the valve and the cap. Now, you should be able to remove the cap. With the cap removed, close all the valves except the uppermost nozzle valve, which should be left open 3 turns to allow air to escape. Partially open the isolation valve and allow the air to escape from the hydrant. When the air is expelled from the hydrant, slowly close the top nozzle valve. Inspect the nozzles to make sure they have sealed properly and that there is no debris caught in the nozzle. Then open the isolation valve fully and replace the caps just tightly enough that they cannot be removed by hand. This segment will demonstrate how to remove a cap with a vent hole that is streaming water. Hydrant caps that feature a vent hole will provide you with a visual indication that there is pressurized water behind the cap, as indicated by a steady stream of water being expelled from the vent hole. If water is streaming from the vent hole, perform the following steps. Try closing the valve of the cap that is streaming water. If the valve was opened and the stream stops, then the problem is solved. Otherwise, proceed to the following steps. First, isolate the hydrant by closing the isolation valve. You can verify that the hydrant is isolated when the stream of water stops. Remove the uppermost nozzle cap and open its valve. This will relieve pressurized water from the hydrant and ensure that the hydrant is isolated. When the pressure is relieved, open the valve of the hydrant with the cap that was expelling water. Remove its cap. With the cap removed, inspect the valve for damage from debris or for excessive torque that may have been applied during operation. If the valve is damaged, replace components as necessary. Most likely this will mean replacing the disc assembly. But it is possible for the sealed surface of the nozzle to be damaged also. If the valve shows no damage or has been replaced, close it. Make sure the topmost nozzle valve is still open at least 3 turns to relieve the air from the hydrant when the isolation valve is opened. Partially open the isolation valve. Once the air is expelled from the hydrant, slowly close the open nozzle valve. Inspect the nozzles. Make sure they are sealed properly and there is no debris caught in a nozzle. Then fully open the isolation valve and replace the caps just tightly enough that they cannot be removed by hand. How many turns will be required to fully open or close the valve? That will depend upon the valve position on the hydrant. For the Jones J4060 wet barrel, use the following. For the top hose nozzle, 8 turns to fully open. For the middle hose nozzle, 12 1/2 turns to fully open. And for the bottom Storz pumper, 12 1/2 turns to fully open. For the model J4060M, turns required are: top hose nozzle, 8 turns to fully open. Middle hose nozzle, 12 1/2 turns to fully open. And for the bottom Storz pumper, 12 turns to fully open. Do not use force when operating any of the valves. Since the nozzle valves are designed to close with water pressure, it is recommended that no more than 30 foot-pounds, 40 Newton-meters of torque should be applied to the operating nut when closing them. Flushing of the hydrant is recommended at least once every year. Caution: in accordance with recommendations from the A.W.W.A. M17 Manual, Chapter 6, never use a rigid diverter when flushing or flow testing wet barrel fire hydrants. To prevent bodily injury, property damage, or damage to the fire hydrant and its supporting structures, use only a diffuser or a flexible hose that's properly restrained at the point of discharge for flushing or flow testing. All hydrants should be inspected regularly, at least once a year, to ensure their satisfactory operation. A common technique is to perform an inspection in the fall and another one in the spring. First, choose which valve you're going to flush. Remove the nozzle cap and connect the diffuser or restrained flexible hose. Then, fully open the valve for that nozzle. When finished flushing, slowly close the nozzle valve, making sure to use no more than 30 foot-pounds, 40 Newton-meters of torque, and ensure that the valve has sealed against the nozzle. Finally, replace the cap and tighten it, just tightly enough that it cannot be removed by hand. Also, follow the recommendations from the A.W.W.A. M17 Manual, Chapter 5. Make sure all nozzle valves are closed and all caps reinstalled. This segment will demonstrate how to replace the disc assembly. Begin by closing the hydrant isolation valve. Remove the topmost nozzle cap. And open its valve to release water pressure. And drain the hydrant. Next, remove the cap from the nozzle where the disc assembly will be replaced. Open the nozzle valve at least 2 turns to release pressure against the nozzle. Using the appropriately sized Jones nozzle wrench, loosen and remove the nozzle, turning it counterclockwise. Remove the retaining nut on the end of the stem. And then the operating nut. Inspect and remove any debris or loose paint from the end of the stem. Turn the stem clockwise until the disc assembly protrudes through the nozzle port. Then extract the entire assembly. Now, locate the 5/32" stainless steel set screw behind the disc holder. With a wrench, loosen the screw 4 or 5 turns. Next, use an open-end wrench to loosen and remove the disc holder assembly from the stem nut and stem. Install a new disc holder assembly. And make sure the 5/32" stainless steel screw is properly tightened. Clean the stem of any dirt or loose paint prior to reinsertion. Wipe the stem's mirror finish with a light coat of non-toxic anti-seize lubricant. Replace the 2 O-rings in the stem insert. Also, inspect the interior of the hydrant for debris or any obstruction. Slide the stem with the new disc assembly attached into the stem insert. And finally, thread the stem to the open position. Before reinstalling the nozzle, inspect and clean the O-ring groove in the hydrant body. Replace the O-ring on the nozzle to assure a proper seal. Thread the nozzle into the hydrant body, taking care not to pinch the O-ring. Using the Jones nozzle wrench, tighten the nozzle to approximately 300 foot-pounds, 405 Newton-meters of torque. Replace the operating nut and retaining nut on the stem, and tighten the retaining nut carefully to prevent stripping the threads. Close the valve. Now, make sure the topmost nozzle valve is still open, with its cap removed. Open the hydrant isolation valve slowly. When all the air is evacuated from the hydrant, close the topmost valve. No Jones hydrant stem should be tightened to more than 30 foot-pounds, 40 Newton-meters of torque. Replace all caps and tighten them just enough to prevent removal by hand. This concludes our training video for the Jones J4060 and J4060M ductile iron wet barrel fire hydrant. This instructional video is only to be used as a training aid. It is not intended as a replacement for the operating instructions or repair manuals. Fire hydrant repairs should be performed only by properly trained maintenance personnel. And remember, always use the appropriate safety equipment, such as eye protection and gloves. And always use genuine Jones parts. Need more information? Call 800-523-8618 or visit www.joneswaterproducts.com.